Books, a discussion of authors who've written books about the conflicts between religious fundamentalists and federal agents at Waco and Ruby Ridge. The discussion lasts about an hour.
Okay, we'd like to begin the panel today on Ruby Ridge and Waco. I'm Richard Popkin, a professor of philosophy and history here at UCLA. He's written a book on Messianic Revolution about the various cults and the background of them. And fortunately today we have three people who have worked on two of the most important events in cult history in the last decade. One, David Thibodeau, who's an actual survivor of Waco. And then we have Leon Whiteson, who worked with him on his book, and Jess Walter, who wrote a book on Ruby Ridge. We're going to have each speaker talk for 10 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions until we get thrown out. So, Jeff, do you want to start first for 10 minutes on?
Sure, I guess I have the oldest book, so I might as well start. I was a 28-year-old, actually at the time I was 26-year-old newspaper reporter working in Spokane, Washington, when the siege of Ruby Ridge began. And I went up there with no preconceived ideas of how to cover it, no political agenda, no axis to grind on either side. And to this day, of all the things I've covered, all the things I've written about, that case still sits in my belly in a way that is hard for me to describe, because everything seems so warped and distorted by what happened up there. And for those of you who aren't familiar, Randy Weaver and his wife were white separatists who decided to live on a mountaintop in the middle of Idaho with their family. Randy Weaver got to know an undercover ATF agent who enticed him to saw off the barrels of a couple shotguns and sell them to him. Whether or not it was entrapment, to me, is sort of beside the point, because what followed certainly shouldn't have occurred just because of this small transaction. But Weaver wouldn't report for court. He believed that the government was out to kill him, and over the next couple of years, the government did everything to prove that he was right. Weaver and his family holed up on their mountaintop. He armed his children, and the government, in trying to arrest him and bring him in, sent marshals up to do surveillance of his house. While the house was under surveillance, there was the family came down with their dog. There was a shootout. A U.S. Marshal was killed, and Weaver's son, Sammy Weaver, 14-year-old son, was shot in the back and killed. The next day, the FBI surrounded the place, and a sniper, Lon Horiuchi, who shows up later at Waco, fired a shot that he claims he was trying to shoot Kevin Harris, who was Randy Weaver's friend who was up there, but instead he hit Randy Weaver's wife in the face as she held a baby in the door of their cabin. I called the book "Every Knee Shall Bow" because there was a sign at the Weaver's house that said "Every knee shall bow to Yahshua Messiah," which is the term they used for Jesus. But it was also the government standpoint too. Both of these sides came in so stubborn and so believing in conspiracy on the other sides. People ask me, were the Weavers conspiracy theorists? Yeah, they were, but so was the government. The Weaver family looked at the government and saw this evil beast. The government looked at the Weaver family, at a husband and a wife, their children in a remote cabin, and saw people who were going to overthrow the government. They were actually charged with conspiring to overthrow the government, which is really tough to do in a cabin without indoor plumbing, I would think. But just to watch this case, two things that just amazed me. I couldn't understand how the Weavers' beliefs could become so strong that they could be so fearful of society and culture and our government that they would put their own children at risk. And I couldn't understand how the government could be so stupid to essentially you had this guy on top of a mountaintop say, "You can't get me, you can't get me." And so what do? They surround his house and try to get him. I think in third grade I would have known better than that. So for me to have covered this event in 1992 and then to see it all replayed again in Waco was so troubling. And again, what I try to do with my book and the way I approach every story is as a journalist. I'm trained as a journalist. And so what I really wanted to do is present an even-handed look at both sides. And looking at both sides, I find it's just tragic. It was so unavoidable. And because of the militarization of federal law enforcement, it can happen again, as we found out in Waco.
Okay. When I saw Jeff's article in Newsweek, taken from his book, the pictures make it look as if it's the biggest battle fought on American soil since the Civil War. And then just within the next year, an even bigger one was fought at Waco. So we have with us two people who are experts on Waco, one from firsthand, David Thibodeau, who will have speak next, who actually was there during the siege and is one of the few survivors. David?
Thank you. Well, I ended up in California playing drums and going to music school. And I happened to go into a place called Guitar Center on Sunset Boulevard one day. And there were two gentlemen standing there over one of the electronic drum sets, David Koresh and Steven Snyder. Steven Snyder's been referred to as David Koresh's second in command. He was the business partner of David Koresh. He was the salesman, three-piece suit. And David came off just the opposite. He had a T-shirt and ripped jeans. Someone who came off very down-to-earth. Someone who's very easy to talk to. And over the course of the next 6 months, I got to know these individuals and play some music with David and hang out with some of the guys that lived there. And I found them to be very, very deep. I mean, it's not really even the word I can use to describe it. Living in Hollywood, I got very excited to find people that actually study and read and use their minds a lot, especially being in the music world. And so I became quite fascinated with what they were teaching, and the more that I learned, the more that I realized there was more to learn and more to learn. And a very interesting point that the gentleman to my right here made was he couldn't understand how people can think that the government is so bad and basically view the scripture as being so literal that it's almost like the forces of Babylon, if you will, become very literal. Living in the group out there at Waco, Texas for 2 years, I started to study the scripture so seriously to the point where I studied every prophet and every apostle, every single word, cross-referenced, to make it all really come alive. And the one thing that scripture tells you about consistently is the difference between the people of God, who have to be contrite and humble, and the difference between the powers that be, or the power structures, that tend to be very proud and arrogant. And people who study this and live this scripture, it's like living a job. It's like a workaholic. It's something that you absorb yourself in, and you start to see such a harmony within the scripture that it becomes a part of your life. And when it became a part of my life, we didn't exactly we viewed the government definitely as something that was out of control, especially watching what had happened with Randy Weaver up there. And we were definitely very fearful, but this all comes from, again, that scripture and living it. Some people call it paranoia, some people call it anti-government. I never considered us to be anti-government. And one of the things I would like to say about that community is so much has been lost in the media blitz that occurred. The people that died at Mount Carmel have been lost sight of who they really were, how they were as people. I mean, they were some of the best, most trustworthy people that I had ever known. And the fact that they were demonized so heavily has weighed on me a great deal. And to finally be able to tell this story in the book, A Place Called Waco, as Leon will attest to, it was great therapy to get it all out. But it needed to be done. This press, when they want to demonize you, when they want to take, there's a quote I like by Senator Henry Clay, and that quote is, "The devices of power and its minions are the same in all countries and in all ages. It marks its victim, denouncing it, exciting the public hatred so it can conceal its own abuses and encroachments." That's what happened. I'm not saying that what was going on there was perfect. I'm not saying that David Koresh was perfect or all the people there were perfect. We were very aware of who we were as people. But the fact that it was used in such a negative light to justify what the government did and demonize David and the people to the point where people wouldn't even listen to my story. And it literally took 5 to 7 years for people to start listening to my story, and I'm glad you're all here listening today. One of the things I think, I'm kind of rambling, but I'd like to make a kind of a warning for the future. And I think that warning should be that when you see something, someone being demonized in such an amazing way, you have to stop and ask yourself, am I being given the correct information here? We have to start looking deeper into what Dan Rather's telling us and to what the press is telling us. And we have to start questioning authority. It seems to me like the administration now, who in the 60s, that was the big mantra, to question authority. Now that they are the authority, they don't want to be questioned. And I think through the press, there's a scripture in Revelation that says, the merchants are the great men of the earth, and through their sorceries, they will deceive many. To me, the greatest sorcery is the television set. And all our minds are led by it consistently. And it's time for intelligent people to start opening their minds and not necessarily believing everything they hear. And it is an honor for me to stand up for my community and try to let people know who these people were. And I think that's what's important. And I guess I would close.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. And when you say demonize, at the time of Waco, I was teaching a class in which I asked the students about it. The students were all on the government side because they'd seen a picture of people shooting out of the compound at the ATF. Nothing else made any sense to them, so they immediately assumed it's a criminal group. And I think many of the people in this country have taken a long time to get some idea of who the group might have been, what they believed, and what the government was doing. And we're just, I guess next month we're going to get to the point where we find out when there's an actual trial and a lot of things get shown to the public, and maybe we'll understand much better. I would like to turn to our third speaker who worked with David, Mr. Whiteson, a writer from South Africa? Zimbabwe, coming all the way here to work on various projects. One of the most recent is the book on Waco.
Thanks. I left Zimbabwe a long, long time ago. It was Rhodesia still in those days. When I started working with David, I must admit I knew no more about what had happened there than what anybody had seen on television. It seemed to me extraordinary. I came to the United States in the middle of 1984. It seemed to me extraordinary that the government should organize such a huge force to surround a small community in the middle of Texas, in the middle of its own countryside. But I didn't think a lot about it. But as I began to talk to David, I could see that the situation was, in many ways, let's put it this way, was too complicated for television, too complicated to understand easily. To start with, a lot of facts were fudged. There was an impression given that David Koresh was a kind of Jim Jones character who'd founded this so-called cult. And even Richard used the word cult in describing, which is an automatic pejorative word. But actually, he hadn't founded it. The community had been founded about 30 years before, no, in the 1930s, actually, long before. And he was the third leader of this community, which was made up largely of a splinter group of people, most of the people who'd been Seventh-day Adventists. David was unusual in that he didn't belong to that particular group, but most of them did. They came from many countries. So that was one important fact. The community had lived peacefully in this area, more or less, for a long time. The way the ATF started this ball rolling was also extraordinarily suspect and has been proven to be suspect. The reasons they chose to attack the Mount Carmel, the so-called compound, another pejorative word that was used for this community, was very suspicious, and even the Treasury Department, which, under which the ATF falls, has denounced the way that was done. But once, and this is another important fact to understand, once a bureaucracy, a powerful bureaucracy begins to roll, there's no way easily to stop it. And once the FBI took over from the ATF after the first disastrous raid, and the ball started rolling, and the FBI started mobilizing its forces, it required someone at the top, in this case our dear President Clinton, to step in and say, wait a minute, what the hell are we doing? Why are we using such force against a community in which there are all these women and children? But he didn't do that. Janet Reno, her excuse is that she was only she only became appointed Attorney General in the middle of this, after the first attack had occurred and during the siege. And she was new to Washington, and she was bamboozled by two very powerful figures who more or less bullied her into going along. One was William Sessions, who was then head of the FBI, and the other was a gentleman called Webster Hubbell, both of whom were later indicted on various criminal charges. And so Rena, whose first response to this when the attack plan was put to her was saying, why not wait? But they convinced her that they were beating babies inside. There were many lies. There were many lies used to justify the attack. However, there was one, and this has to be admitted, there was one action for which David Koresh was criminally liable, and that is statutory rape. And that has clouded the issue. And he is no hero in that sense. But the government never brought a charge against him of statutory rape for numbers of reasons. Experts I've talked to say it's very hard to prove a case of statutory rape, especially when the children and the parents of the children agree, go along and allow this to happen. Inside a closed community where the leader is a kind of demigod, the pressure on a young child of 12 to a young girl of 12 to go along with this, it's a great privilege. And although many of them were apparently later, it came out rather terrified, the enormous peer pressure in this closed community was intense. So on that level, what he did was unforgivable. I don't care, maybe David will argue with me about this, but that's absolutely true and has to be admitted. And that has clouded the issue. And when the congressional this comes back to the question of demonization. When the congressional hearings were held in '95, the whole thing ended up as a demonization of David Koresh, and in a way legitimately, but for the wrong reasons. He deserved to be excoriated for what he did in that level. But they used that as an excuse not to examine the real issues. This was the whole problem. And I think this goes to a larger issue. The United States was first settled by what the English call nonconformists. That is, the religious groups who did not belong to the Church of England. And they came here, there were the Puritans, many of them, different sects. And they came to the United States because they couldn't conform. And this has led to an extremely awkward relationship of the governmental authorities in the United States with so-called cults or nonconformists. How do you allow these people in this country, which has no state religion, unlike England, to operate? Anybody, on one hand, it's the God-given right of any American to invent any goddamn religion he likes. Why not? Anybody can invent a religion in this country and find followers. And that's their right. But the government authorities find it very awkward to accommodate these people. And this really is the story of Waco. And experts that were in a sense, consulted after the fact by the government, by the Justice Department and the Treasury Department said this. There was a culture of prejudice in the FBI and the Justice Department against anybody who believed, who they considered religious fanatics. So they dealt with this whole thing very clumsily. They had to demonize Koresh. They knew no other way to go about it. So there are many lessons to be learned about how subtly a government should handle people who are nonconformists, and how people who are nonconformists, if you like, if they don't want to run into trouble, should be careful in some areas of what they do. They should not commit criminal acts if they can help it. But still, it's a very, very tricky area, and it's one that Americans don't particularly, I'm saying this as an ex-foreigner. This is one area Americans don't particularly want to look in very deeply, this complicated relationship of authority with the God-given right of anybody to do whatever they like, which is why people came to the United States in the first place. Many of the immigrants who came here in different waves were escaping established powers, Babylon, their forms of Babylon. And this is, I think, at the heart of the Waco question that it really needs to be looked at.
Thank you. Let me make a few comments before I throw it open to the floor. The matter of the statutory rape was not part of the ATF's business. That is why they came to the compound. It wasn't part of the FBI's business.
Absolutely.
But suddenly it took over the whole case after the fact. And in the congressional hearing, one of the major witnesses was a young woman who was seduced by Koresh. So the congressional hearing was dealing with this rather than why the raid took place, what reasons the government had for doing it, and why it came to this drastic end. So that what we now have as a picture isn't what it was at the time. And if one wants to explore why this disaster happened, I think one has to go back to the state of affairs that was publicly known at the time and publicly part of the government's reason for having any action. Both Waco and Ruby Ridge have gradually grown and grown in our imagination and are as warnings of the great dangers of government intervention. I don't know if others felt the way I did a week ago when suddenly you see the same thing about to happen in Miami and somebody's advising Janet Reno that there's child abuse going on, and that's exactly what precipitated the climax at Waco. So before the seizure of Elion, I had visions they'd do it all over again, and then you see the picture of all these armed people, that the government has this sort of power against small little groups, and whether they use it rightly or wrongly depends on what the citizenry is willing to put up with. So I think we have to carefully examine these cases and try and arrange a society in which this cannot happen again. Having said this, let's open the floor to questions, discussion. Can I ask you, can you help me? I can't see very well, so can you point out? Would you identify yourself, please?
Yes, my name is Dan Gifford. Bunch of addresses to Jess Walter and Leon Whiteson and David. I wonder if, Jess, you could talk a little bit about the issue about fabrication of evidence, both at Ruby Ridge and at Waco, particularly the fabrication of a criminal history on Randy Weaver in order to attack him, and also at Waco, where prior to the raid, about a week prior to the raid, ATF agents take their firearms, their weapons, out to the Davidians and allow the Davidians to fire them, then go tell the judge that they are firing illegal automatic weapons on the building, and talk about a little bit about what that does to the moral authority to prosecute.
Well, with the Weaver case, it was simple. They, if you remember the order, the neo-Nazi white supremacist group that committed bombings and murders trying to overthrow the government. When that happened, the FBI and the ATF were caught off guard, and so they decided they were going to infiltrate all of these groups. So they did. In fact, they infiltrated so well. I have one wiretap in which there's an FBI agent, an ATF agent, and one poor neo-Nazi stuck in the middle. You know, 2 of the 3 people at this meeting in which they're planning to overthrow the government were federal agents, and the only one who doesn't seem to want to go along with it is the guy who's actually the neo-Nazi, you know, who lives in some small remote cabin. So and within that zeal, you also have to understand two things. One, the militarization, as I said, of federal law enforcement. Richard was talking about watching the Elian Gonzalez thing unfold. One thing that doesn't occur to people is, why does INS have a SWAT team? Why does, you know, did you know the IRS has a SWAT team? A few years ago, in response to the weapons that are out among the populace, federal government decided we need all these units to have their own SWAT teams. Well, they compete for federal dollars. So the ATF and the FBI didn't know about each other's informants. They didn't know what each other was doing. They were looking for an informant. Randy Weaver had run for sheriff and was a former Special Forces soldier. So they said, maybe we can turn this guy. And again, whether or not he volunteered to saw the shotgun barrels off, or whether or not an informant convinced him to, it's really beside the point. The fact is they wanted him to saw the barrels off these shotguns so then they could go to him and say, we'll arrest you unless you become an informant for us. Now, this guy who believes that the tribulation is about to come, that federal agents are about to come up to his house and kill his children, when the government comes and tells him that, it strikes this incredible chord of fear. So he runs back to his cabin and writes letters and, dear Queen of Babylon, you will never take me alive. And it was the fabrication of a criminal record. I mean, this guy had a couple of speeding tickets before then. Once everything started happening, when a U.S. Marshal was killed, they exaggerated, when they sent their information along to the FBI, they exaggerated even further his criminal history and even started talking about potential bank robberies that he may have talked about or been involved in, talked about different people he knew who were involved in crimes. All of this was to justify the fact that they had botched this this attempt to arrest him, and one of their agents had been killed. They also said that this ferocious dog of the Weavers had attacked them. Turned out it was a golden lab who was shot in the back, who was shot in the rear end as he also ran away. So the level of trying to cover your backside. I mean, federal agents are no different than any of the rest of us. My daughter breaks a lamp with the Nerf football, and she blames it on everyone else and claims all these problems, and that's what you saw in these cases, and it's sad, but with this militarization of federal law enforcement, blaming someone else and creating a larger scare than is there can have just disastrous results, as we saw and as luckily we didn't see in Miami.
I'd like to add to that, actually. In the Waco case, several things took place. It stuns me, frankly. To get the helicopters that they used on the first day that the BATF used, they claimed that there was a methamphetamine lab inside the building. There was never any drugs when it came to Koresh. She didn't even take aspirin during the siege when he was shot. That was one of the things that they said, fabrication, or justification to get those helicopters, because under one of the U.S. laws, as long as there's drugs involved, then it's okay to use helicopters and military equipment against U.S. citizens. To me, that's just absolutely outlandish. And the fact that they had no evidence at all that there was any kind of drugs or methamphetamines going on in Mount Carmel, and yet they still had this military attack with helicopters. I always remember a very interesting point, just to kind of show how the propaganda machine works. When the BATF attacked on the first day, one group of and this came out in the trials in San Antonio, it actually, one of the agents testified that the first shots may have been fired at the agents shooting our dogs that were penned up in an area. I can't harp on this enough. They came in, all guns blazing, shooting our dogs in cold blood. They were penned up. They couldn't have not have hurt these agents at all. Just like in Randy Weaver's case, the first thing they shot the dog in the back. And then they put out an ATF propaganda film called In the Line of Duty that was literally made, written, and recorded during the siege. I think it was completed before the end, before April 19th. And in this movie, which is 100% propaganda, a quick example is the man that wrote that particular film, Mr. Penningroth, has come forward and written a 10-page apology letter that he revealed at one of our memorials, apologizing for writing the film, claiming that he had gotten all this information from the government and put it into a film. And now that he has seen the true evidence, he compares himself to Leni Riefenstahl, who did the Hitler documentaries, and says, this is to my everlasting shame and contempt. But in this movie, when they're attacking us, they show the agents coming up to the dogs with fire extinguishers, spraying the dogs with fire extinguishers, so to soften the whole image of the agents raiding the building. They did not have fire extinguishers that day. They had fully automatic weapons, and they blew our dogs away. And this is the kind of thing that they do in this propaganda film to make it look like they're on the right side. I mean, it was basically a film that was to make heroes out of the ATF agents that died, and at all cost to the truth. That's the point I wanted to make.
Well, I think my comment is that the word, you have to understand the key word is the word agent. These people are agents of the government, of the civil authority, the elected government. And where each one has its own agenda and is competing for various funds, the real oversight lies with the people in the government. The people, Reno at the head of the Justice Department, the President. These are the people who should be questioning and controlling their agents, and they are not doing it. That is the problem. I think they have gotten a little cautious. I think Reno havered and chavered a while before she sent in the cavalry. But I think in the end, you cannot look to the culture of these agencies very easily and change them, because in a way that is what they're trained to do. They're trained to go in and act. And this came out very strongly at Waco. There was a tremendous tension between the people who were negotiating, the FBI negotiators who were talking all the time, over 200 hours of negotiation with the people inside during the siege, who were always trying to hold off the hostage rescue, the tactical people who wanted to go in there and blow them away, because that is what they were trained to do. What comes out of it is a total lack of control at the top, of people firstly questioning the attack plan, those who allowed the ATF to attack in the first place, the Treasury people, the Treasury Department. That is where the problem lies. I think you have to have much stronger willingness to control at that level. Those are the people who should be accountable for what happens, because the people down the line can say, well, that is what we were trained to do, and we were given the go-ahead. So what's the problem?
And I think one has to remember, first, it's the very second month of Clinton's administration. He'd had trouble getting an Attorney General. Janet was the third nominee. So there's a bit of chaos in the law enforcement department. William Sessions was head of the FBI, was retiring. So there was nobody really in charge of that. So one had to sort of break down on the very level you say is so important, so that the people at the top weren't aware of what was going on. But another aspect, which I think is almost entirely lost, is the ATF was under tremendous scrutiny at the time for corruption. There had been programs on 60 Minutes and so on showing that they were stealing money, they were having sexual liaisons with the people they were supposed to be investigating. And there was even a movement to get rid of the ATF. And I remember a program explaining the ATF began at the time of the American Revolution. It's for another century, another problem. We didn't need it anymore. And I think that it's about to go down the tube. And this is their chance for redemption. They're going to have an easy win and show that they could really enforce the law and so on. So there's a lot of factors which led to the chaotic response and the disastrous response. Anybody else want to participate?
I have a question. Do you need me to go over there?
I don't think the acoustics are too good in here.
I have a sense of, I don't agree with the law enforcement tactics, nor do I agree with the Koresh tactics or the tactics that were approached by the neo-Nazi folks. And I have a sense of where responsibility should have been and sort of who let the ball drop. But I would really like to hear a little bit from you about how it should have been, in the best of worlds. There was somebody at the top saying, okay, this is the way we're going to handle these situations. How would each of these situations been handled?
I can go first. One veteran FBI agent told me that when he was in the FBI, it was all lawyers. He said, and he used the civil rights. Very many FBI cases in the South during the civil rights movement as the FBI's shining moment. And you don't recall any SWAT team tactics. It was that they let local law enforcement handle things like that. But when they wouldn't do it, then they stepped in and they negotiated and they worked behind the scenes. The Weaver case is simple. I mean, Randy Weaver lived on a mountaintop a mile from the nearest neighbor. There was no road. You just let that guy sit there. I mean, what had he done? He'd sawed off a shotgun. When he decides to put his children in danger, then he sawed off 2 shotguns. They were not used in a crime, and so it would have caused no problem to let him sit up there. Eventually, he would have come down for groceries, and you could have arrested him. And even if you didn't, it wouldn't have been a big problem. But after the agent I was telling you about retired, he said that Lon Horiuchi, Richard Rogers, names that you'll hear at Waco and Ruby Ridge, these are former military guys. They come in, this FBI agent said, we didn't have ops plans. Everything they come in with is an ops plan, an operations plan. Okay, we're going to move the tanks in this way. At one point, their plan with the Weaver case was to run the house over with a big tank. And then the people would scurry and they could shoot the bad guys and arrest the children, I suppose. But it's senseless, it's a family. And I think the Freeman case in Montana was, after the lessons were learned at Ruby Ridge and Waco, the Freeman case was handled correctly. They just waited those people out. They didn't turn them into martyrs, because I don't find anything more abhorrent than the Weavers' racial beliefs. But the fact that they went up and shot them up gave more momentum to the to white separatists than if they just let those people sit on the mountaintop. It gave a million times more momentum, and it brought them into the mainstream. So to me it's simple. You sit, you wait them out, you negotiate, and federal law enforcement, unless they're facing an army themselves, should not bring an army.
Yeah, I'm dying for this one. What could have been done differently at Waco, number one, is when David Kresh's person, the man, Henry McMahon, who we bought all the firearms from, when the ATF raided Henry McMahon about 3 months before the whole siege, and they were asking Henry a lot of questions about David Kresh, and Henry got on the phone, and he called David, and he said, David, I have the ATF here, and they're asking me a lot of questions about you. What do you want me to do? And he said, send them on out, Henry. They can check out any of the yellow sheets on any of the firearms that you have sold to me. Better yet, put them on the phone. I'll speak to him. The lead agent, Davey Aguilera, when Henry McMahon went in the other room, he says, I have David Kresh on the phone, and he wants to talk to you. Davey Aguilera shook his head and raised his hands above his head, say, no, hang up. So he said, David, I have to call you back, and hung up. Right there, they were offered by David to come out and check the yellow sheets on every single firearm that he had, and they chose not to. When the undercover agents were across the street, and they came over on, I believe it was 9 occasions they came into the house, fired weapons on our firing range with David, saw no signs of illegal activity. Robert Rodriguez, the undercover agent, even told his superiors that they should not have gone forward with a raid. Now, they still did go forward with the raid, and we had what we did have. During this 51-day siege, every single time we asked for something in all seriousness and sincerity, it was denied. If 10 people came out, they wanted 50 people to come out. They would put pressure on us, and when 50 people did not want to go out at that particular time, the tanks would come in, destroy our property, run over our cars, run over the children's bicycles and tricycles. They did everything they could to antagonize the people inside that building. They set up speaker systems, played loud noises of rabbits being slaughtered. They played, took the phone off the hook for 48 hours at a time, playing that beeping sound. They would wake us up at 6 in the morning with reveille. Things like this, always antagonizing. We literally asked them to prove our point. We knew that the helicopters fired, and the evidence in that building would show that the helicopters on the first day fired into that building, which was always denied by the BATF. We asked them to send in a crew like 60 Minutes to come inside and videotape the inside of the building as evidence, because we did not know what they would do to the building once we exited the building. That was denied. We made videotapes of the inside to give to the attorneys. That was never released to the public. Every single person in there actually did an interview with Steve Schneider to show where they were at. You could see that these were real people, that they weren't psychotic religious fanatics that just wanted to go down in a blaze of glory. They talked about their experience on February 28th, where they were in the building, what they saw, what happened. This, I'll try to get to that. It's a very complicated point, but when that tape was sent out, that basically humanized the people. We thought that that would go to the press. Of course it didn't. The FBI suppressed that. And in the Justice Department report, it said the FBI suppressed the videotape of the people inside because they felt that it would cause much public support and sympathy for the Davidians. In other words, they couldn't have demonized us the way they did had people seen this tape when we wanted it out. In other words, we're begging for the press. We're asking for them to come in. That's not allowed. Most importantly, David Koresh spoke a language. That language was the scripture, Genesis to Revelation, on such a deep level that people like Wayne Martin, Harvard-educated attorney, and Steve Schneider believed 100% in this person, and other people believed in him. They had two theologians that were experts in their field, and David Koresh asked for them by name to be used in negotiations to come in and speak David Koresh's language. The FBI certainly weren't doing it. Their language was now or never. And that would have helped a great deal. And it would help the people inside to actually have someone that, his whole career is around the scripture, to have someone like that speak to David. That's something that they could have done to help to bring the people out, to help David Koresh and the people that are around him see that there are people out there that understand. And they never allowed that to happen either. It seems like everything we asked for was not allowed.
Like, for example, when I was a teenager, we were out there, peace and love, and the police would come, okay, you guys, get over there, all that stuff. And people, I'm sure others of you have had that experience. When the peace, and we were just, going like this, and when the police came and said, everybody move off of this patch of grass and go over to the sidewalk, we all moved.
Here's the difference.
Okay, but and I'm just wondering, I feel like if I was in the building when they were out there with guns saying, come out, I would have come out with my hands up.
Yeah,
and you would have been allowed to.
If you had, it's not a correct analogy, because when you were demonstrating peace and love, if they had first come and shot at you and killed 4 or 5 of you, would you then have been that willing to disperse and take it easy? Because that is what had happened.
On your property, in your house.
It began with this horrible, unjustified, highly militarized attack on this compound out of the blue.
So
I would have, even if other people had been killed.
Others
But
want to raise some points, but let me say, the people inside have the problem that the attack starts as a military attack against them, which some of them get killed, and they don't know what's going to happen if they come out of the building. Then what follows, it gets worse and worse.
So you thought you'd be killed if you came out.
And their own scripture gives them an expectation that this is the way the world's going to come to an end. And they're at the last moments of world history.
That's the major point. What you just said is actually the major point.
These aren't people saying peace, love. They're saying apocalypse is coming. So when an army shows up with tanks and shoots people, the Weavers did come out the day after the standoff. They came out to look around. A helicopter flew somewhere nearby, according to the FBI agents, and the federal agents started firing. So the next day, they sent a robot up to the house, and it had a shotgun attached to it, pointing at the house, and said, "Come out." I don't know that I would come out if I come out one time I get shot, and the next time they send a robot with a shotgun to tell me.
Well, that's also like a tank coming through your living room, and then they're saying this is not an assault. Come out, come out. When a tank comes through your living room door, you don't exactly run out the hole it just came in. It's quite frightening. It's quite terrifying. You tend to back away from it.
The thing is, we haven't really answered your original question, which is how it should have been handled. And that's interesting in the case of Waco, because the local law enforcement authorities, the local sheriff and the Texas Rangers never bothered about the Davidians. They had been living there for 50 or 60 years. They were a weird bunch. Texas is full of some strange people, and they're very live and let live is very much the matter. They had a lot of guns, but so did everyone in Texas. But this is interesting, there's an overlay of these authorities. The ATF came in, they didn't want to tell either the Texas Rangers or the local sheriff what they were doing, because they said they couldn't trust them. So they went in and completely overrode the local people, never consulted them, never talked to them. and just went in. They knew nothing about this community, except as Richard was saying, they needed a dramatic event. And that is another problem, the overlay of these authorities. Now, once it had happened that way, as I said earlier, the bureaucracy gets rolling. Could the FBI step in and say, okay, 4 agents have been killed and 16 wounded, let's walk away? Their machismo wouldn't allow it.
And I think the matter of what happened to Montana Freeman, which is years later, indicates what could be done, but only was taken seriously in view of what had happened previously. Montana Freemen were challenging the government of the United States. They're going to destroy all authority and so on. And so what got done is they surrounded them for 75 days and negotiated, and finally came to a settlement in which some of them got arrested, and that was the end of it. I met a man about 3 months after the Waco siege at Oxford who had written a thesis shortly before this on the Branch Davidians at Stanford. He said nobody ever consulted him. Nobody ever looked up who knew what this is all about, who had some idea what the theology was and what the way of life was. They weren't interested at all in this sort of things. They treated it as a military exercise against the evil empire of 100 people inside a little building 10 miles from anywhere, so just living their own lives. Yes.
I wanted to just make a comment. During the Vietnam protests and during the civil rights marches, a lot of very peaceful activists were really brutalized and went to jail. A lot of very innocent people were brutalized and went to jail who never, who followed the civil disobedience rules and regulations to the hilt. So while some of us were moving when we were asked to, while all of that was happening, a lot of people were being brutalized and sent to jail. And the thing that about Waco that I've really thought about very deeply, and I would like for you guys to talk about a bit more, is there are many different levels of activism in any given situation and involvement and willingness. And in the very beginning days of the siege, one of the things that happened at Waco, which is pretty much unheard of, is that people came out. People that came out, some people came out who didn't want to come out, but people came out and children came out. And that set a precedent, a very remarkable precedent, which should have said, with the right kind of behavior, there is an absolutely peaceful solution to this dilemma. But the peaceful solution was never really allowed. It just was from day one. Everything was reported and dealt with in such a negative persona that we all knew that we were going to watch a terrible demise on television. There was no doubt in my mind whatsoever. But I think it was really important that there be a sense of dignity, that community be allowed in order to actually come out and face the kind of stuff that they were going to be facing with law enforcement after coming out. And I know from my readings with Tabor and with Arnold that bridge of a sense of dignity was really very palpable with those two men. And I'd like you to talk a little bit more about the impact that Tabor and Arnold actually had on David Koresh's willingness to consider following the negotiations to the end.
Tabor and Arnold were the two theologians that what had happened is they had seen all this unfold on television, and they started to look into some of David Koresh's teachings. Somehow they get hold of some old tapes or some old scriptures, and they started to see that what the guy was saying, David sent out a 58-minute tape, and they started to read it, and they started to see that this absolutely has a scriptural foundation. It's not just a guy saying he's Christ and a bunch of dupes that are following him. This is a very deep scriptural relevance that he's coming from. And what they did is they got on a radio show, probably the only show that was sympathetic to our point of view, if you will, the Ron Engelman show. And they did an interview with Ron Engelman that I heard and made David aware of it, recorded it. And so David was absolutely ecstatic when he heard this, because that's what he'd been seeking. He'd been seeking people that could either prove him wrong or show him another path from the visions that he had. Tabor and Arnold would have been perfect. They spoke his language. And the government never allowed that to happen. They did not allow Tabor and Arnold to speak with David Koresh. And here's a guy that 24, no matter what you think of him, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, he is walking the walk and talking the talk of the Scripture. Not just the good Scriptures of Christianity, but the Scripture from Genesis to Revelation, almost fulfilling it. He said in the study once, I'm not going to go scriptural on you, but I want you to have an understanding. David once held the Bible up to his head and he said, some people see this book as 2 pieces of cow leather with a bunch of pages in between. I see it panoramically, and he held it up to his forehead, as if it's happening right now in front of me. And when he started to give a study, you got that impression that he saw the vision. Not only did he see the vision of the entire Scripture, he could give it to you in a way that you could understand it. It was on such a deep level that they needed minds like Tabor and Arnold to speak to David and show him from that Scripture that there was another plan. That's what they wanted to do. They wanted to say that there was this little season, that, this doesn't have to be the end. This can be the beginning.
But it was Tabor who said, I think it's on your film, he said in the end, the FBI provided Koresh with the apocalypse he needed. So that was a comment he made, which was quite shrewd in a sense. They fulfilled his prophecies.
And there's one more point, and this goes to the case the gentleman here was talking about too, is if the apocalypse isn't coming true, all right, these people are reading the Scripture thinking the government's going to come down on them, and then they come down on them with the force that they do. That makes it very true to the people inside thinking this is going to happen. To them, it's prophecy being fulfilled. That's very powerful. When you think that if you're on the side of God, just like all Christians in Christianity fed to the lions, the Christians in their early days had to face incredible odds and stand up sometimes with their lives for their faith to God. And when you think that God is punishing you because he loves you and he wants you to move on into the next realm, then you're not just going to walk out to the authorities that God's using to punish you. And the FBI had no concept of this. They didn't want to read that Scripture. They didn't want to understand where those people were coming from. And that's a big part of the problem, I think. I think that's something. And one of the things that Tabor and Arnold did was they put together a panel, in case anything like this happens again, of religious leaders and theologians from all over the world, a special panel. So if anything like this happens again, they're going to come down and they're going to speak Scripture to the group of people that this might happen to. And in the next millennium here, I'm sure that we'll see this again. And I hope that the FBI, please, I hope that you use the wisdom of these people that can speak the language of the group that doesn't want to come out because they believe that they are right and that God is with them.
I was struck at the time that the FBI was told by Koresh they couldn't deal with him for the next few days. He had to celebrate Passover. So they think it's a big joke. They know Passover is a Jewish holiday. So what's it got to do with these people in Mount Carmel? And then say, consult somebody and find out the Jewish Passover is on a different date. They don't even ask the Seventh-day Adventists, do they celebrate Passover? When do they celebrate it? It turns out Koresh is just following the Seventh-day Adventist practice, which they could have found out with a telephone call. Yes.
Yeah, I did grow up in an extreme right-wing fundamentalist sort of thing, so I sort of have a view from that part of the world. But I guess I'm just a little concerned that when a right-wing fundamentalist or whatever cult-type group gets heavily armed, how the government is going to be responding to that, because we have this huge military-industrial complex looking for something to do, and I don't think that we've seen the end of this sort of a thing at all. I think this may very possibly be the beginning, especially when some of those religions are maybe from a foreign country and things like that. I just want to hear comments about the future of these kinds of things.
History repeating itself?
Well, as I say, I think that's very true. I mean, they did have a lot of guns in Waco, in the Mount Carmel. They were partly, to be honest, I think they were selling guns to raise money. They were going to gun shows to raise money for the community. But Koresh liked guns, and he was a Texan, and he'd grown up using guns, and he was fascinated by firearms, which apparently a number of people in this country are, from what one reads. But I think in the end it does come down to the judgment of the people we elect, of making careful discriminations about who is really dangerous. And this group at Waco had never threatened anybody in the local community. As I said, they'd lived there from the middle of the 1930s, 60 years without causing any trouble to the surrounding community. So that was part of the judgment that should have been made. They had a lot of guns, but they were willing to show them to the ATF. Maybe some of them were illegal, in which case there was a fine, an appropriate fine. It's a delicate, every human relationship depends on a particularity of circumstance and character. You have to look at the circumstance, the character, and it has to be somebody in authority who makes a judgment about what these people, are they a real threat? How do we handle that threat? And that has to be made at the very highest level. It cannot be made at the level of the FBI, the ATF, or anybody else, because that's not what they're trained to do. They're trained to act, to carry out orders. They're agents. But somehow at the highest levels of government, this has never been thought through. How do we really evaluate each situation? Well, the Freeman one was handled well, finally. Are these people a real threat? I mean, they may have a lot of guns, but are they going to overthrow the government? Or are they just messing about with guns? What's going on? Let's look at particularity. And as David said, these people believed in a particular scripture. What does that mean to them? Let's try and talk their language. These are subtle moves that any human relationship requires. And the people we elect ought to be capable of making these judgments in case by case. And that's what has to happen. If they are dangerous, if they are not only saying we want to overthrow the government, but they're out there trying to do it, that's one thing. It must be understood that the FBI has used infiltration tactics way back. They infiltrated communist cells. They infiltrated the Black Panthers. They've used this tactic. It's perfectly legitimate to use an infiltration, to put your own agents there. They did that with the mafia. They've done that all the time. To then actually provoke and to entrap is an escalation. It's another matter. But these are subtle judgments that have to be made by people in real authority, by the civil government. This is a country of laws. And those people have to be able to read those laws and apply them case by case. I think that is the only possible answer.
I'm afraid our time is up, so I'd like to thank all the speakers and thank the audience for coming. I was told to tell you that there's a reception tonight for the book awards at 7 o'clock, and you get tickets over at Royce Hall. Where are the books that people will be signing?
Right across the building.